How 20,000 Crusaders defeated armies twice their size and took Jerusalem. In the summer of 1099, a battered Crusader army stood outside the walls of Jerusalem. They were not the vast host that had left Europe. They were the survivors. 3 years earlier, tens of thousands had taken the cross and marched east. Knights, infantry, priests, servants, craftsmen, peasants, nobles, women, children, and camp followers had streamed out of France, Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries, convinced that the road to Jerusalem was the road to salvation. Some estimates suggest that the organized Prince's Crusade may have crossed into Asia with around 50,000 people, including perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 mounted knights and tens of thousands of infantry and non-combatants. Other numbers vary, because medieval armies were rarely counted with precision, but the pattern is clear. The army that began the campaign was large. The army that reached Jerusalem was not. By the time the Crusaders saw the holy city, disease had taken thousands. Hunger had taken thousands more. Turkish arrows, mountain passes, desert heat, ambushes, sieges, desertion, thirst, and exhaustion had carved the army down month after month. Horses had died by the thousands. Knights who had crossed Europe in armor now walked on foot. Men who had once ridden behind banners now dragged themselves through dust with cracked lips, empty stomachs, and rusting weapons. And yet they still took Jerusalem. This is the central mystery of the First Crusade. How did an army that kept shrinking continue to win? How did a force of roughly 20,000 fighting men, sometimes fewer, survive battles against enemies described as 30,000, 50,000, or even larger? How did starving Crusaders defeat the Seljuks at Dorylaeum, survive the death march across Anatolia, capture Antioch, break Kerbogha's huge relief army, storm Jerusalem, and then defeat the Fatimid army at Ascalon? The answer is not simple. It was not because the Crusaders were always better soldiers. It was not because their enemies were weak. It was not because the numbers in medieval chronicles can be trusted without question. The truth is more interesting. The Crusaders survived because they combined heavy cavalry shock, desperate infantry discipline, religious morale, battlefield improvisation, enemy disunity, logistical brutality, and an astonishing ability to keep moving after disasters that should have ended the expedition. This is the First Crusade told through numbers. Not just who marched, not just who prayed, but how many fought, how many died, how many were left, and how the survivors kept defeating armies that should have destroyed them. The first lesson came before the real armies even arrived. In 1096, before the great princes had finished preparing, a mass movement of ordinary people surged toward the east. This was the People's Crusade, led by preachers like Peter the Hermit and by lesser nobles such as Walter Sansavoir. Its numbers are difficult to establish, but many accounts speak of tens of thousands. Some modern estimates suggest perhaps 20,000 to 40,000 people moved in this early wave, though only a fraction were trained fighters. That was the problem. The People's Crusade had numbers, but not an army. It had faith, but not logistics. It had courage, but not command. Most of its followers were peasants, poor townsmen, women, children, and lightly armed volunteers. Some carried swords. Others carried spears, axes, knives, clubs, farm tools, or nothing useful at all. They believed God would provide food, direction, and victory. But the road to Jerusalem did not forgive disorder. As these crowds passed through Hungary and the Balkans, they clashed with local populations. They stole supplies, provoked retaliation, and lost cohesion. By the time they reached Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos understood that this was not the disciplined Western reinforcement he had requested. It was a moving crisis. Alexios ferried them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor. There, the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan watched them carefully. The Crusaders near Nicaea were divided, hungry and undisciplined. Some raided nearby territory, others argued. They ignored warnings. Then in October 1096 near Sivtat, the Seljuks struck. Turkish mounted archers surrounded and destroyed the People's Crusade. Thousands were killed, others were captured and enslaved. Only a small number escaped back to Byzantine territory. The numbers tell the lesson. Tens of thousands had marched. Only fragments survived. The People's Crusade proved that faith without military structure could become slaughter. The Prince's Crusade would be different. When the main armies arrived in 1096 and 1097, they were still chaotic by modern standards, but they had something the People's Crusade lacked: commanders, knights, infantry, supply arrangements, and battlefield experience. There was no single supreme general, but there were powerful leaders: Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Stephen of Blois, Hugh of Vermandois, Tancred, and Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy. Their combined host was enormous for the age. Some historians estimate that after gathering near Constantinople and crossing into Asia Minor, the Crusader movement may have included around 50,000 people. Within that number were perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 mounted knights, around 25,000 to 30,000 infantry, and a large mass of non-combatants: servants, pilgrims, clergy, craftsmen, and camp followers. This was both strength and weakness. On paper, 50,000 people looked intimidating. On the road, 50,000 mouths were a nightmare. Every day they needed food, every horse needed fodder, every mule needed water, every soldier needed space on narrow roads. The army could stretch for miles. Orders took time to travel. Foraging parties wandered dangerously far from the main column. If supplies failed, the army could begin dying before the enemy appeared. The first major test was Nicaea. Nicaea was the Seljuk capital, sitting dangerously close to Constantinople. Taking it mattered to both the Byzantines and the Crusaders. For Alexios, it was a chance to recover a key city. For the Crusaders, it was proof that they could fight a real campaign in Asia. The siege began in May 1097. The Crusader army surrounding Nicaea may have numbered tens of thousands, but the city itself was strongly defended. Its walls were long and reinforced by many towers. Its rear was protected by a lake, allowing supplies to enter by boat. The Crusaders could threaten the landward walls, but they could not fully starve the city until the lake was controlled. Kilij Arslan underestimated them. He had destroyed the People's Crusade and believed this new army might be another undisciplined mob. When he realized the danger, he gathered his forces and attacked the besiegers. The Seljuks relied on speed, mounted archery, and shock raids. They hoped to break the Crusader line before the siege became irreversible. But this time, the Franks held. The Crusaders were not the People's Crusade. Their knights could countercharge, their infantry could maintain positions, their leaders could reinforce threatened sectors. Kilij Arslan's attack failed, and Nicaea's fate was sealed when the Byzantines brought boats onto the lake and negotiated the city's surrender. The Crusaders won, but they did not get the plunder they expected. Byzantine banners rose over Nicaea before the Crusaders could sack it. The city returned to imperial control. Many Crusaders felt cheated. But militarily, the result mattered. The first real obstacle had fallen. The army moved east. Then came Dorylaeum. If the story of the First Crusade has one early moment where the entire expedition nearly died in a single morning, it is Dorylaeum on July 1st, 1097. After leaving Nicaea, the Crusader host split into two main columns. This was done partly because of supply. One giant army consumed everything in its path. Dividing the force made movement easier, but it created a deadly risk. If one column was attacked before the other could help, the Crusaders could be destroyed piece by piece. Bohemond's column marched ahead. It included Bohemond's Normans, Robert of Normandy, Stephen of Blois, Robert of Flanders, and others, along with infantry and non-combatants. Estimates vary, but a common reconstruction places this forward group at perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people, of whom maybe 10,000 to 15,000 were combatants. Some older or traditional accounts place the enemy at 25,000, 30,000, or even 50,000. Some modern scholars argue Kilij Arslan may have had fewer, perhaps 6,000 to 10,000 mounted warriors. The exact number is debated. But from the Crusaders' perspective, what mattered was not a historian's table. What mattered was that they were surrounded. At dawn, Turkish mounted archers descended on Bohemon's camp. The Crusaders had little time to form. Arrows came in clouds. Turkish riders circled at speed, shooting from outside the range of most Frankish weapons, then wheeling away before the knights could close. Horses screamed and fell. Foot soldiers raised shields. Camp followers ran toward the center. Women, servants, priests, and wounded men were trapped inside a tightening ring of arrows and dust. Bohemond made the decision that saved the column. He did not allow the whole army to dissolve into wild charges. He ordered his knights to dismount and form a defensive line. The infantry and non-combatants were pulled into the center. The Crusaders turned the camp into a human fortress. Shields faced outward. Knights fought on foot. Crossbowmen and archers answered where they could. The goal was no longer victory. The goal was to survive until help arrived. For hours, the forward column endured. This was the first great numerical test. If Kilij Arslan had 25,000 to 30,000 men, then Bohemon's 10,000 to 15,000 combatants were outnumbered roughly 2 to 1. If the older figure of 50,000 is used, the odds become even more dramatic. Perhaps 15,000 fighting Crusaders against a mounted force more than 3 times their size. Even if the lower modern estimates are preferred, the tactical situation still favored the Turks. They had mobility. They had surprise. They had the terrain. They chose the moment. The Crusaders had one advantage. They refused to break. Then the second Crusader column arrived. Godfrey, Raymond, Hugh, and the rest of the army came onto the field. The balance changed instantly. What had been a desperate defensive battle became a counterattack. The Crusader knights mounted and charged. Turkish horse archers, so deadly against a trapped enemy, were vulnerable when forced to face heavy cavalry supported by fresh reinforcements. Kilij Arslan withdrew. Dorylaeum was a Crusader victory. But it was not an easy one. Casualty figures vary wildly. Some accounts suggest thousands of Crusaders were killed, perhaps around 4,000 if later figures are accepted cautiously. Turkish losses may also have been heavy, though exact numbers are impossible. The important point is this: the First Crusade survived its first great ambush because a smaller forward column held long enough for the larger army to arrive. Dorylaeum taught the Crusaders how they could win while outnumbered. Do not chase too early. Protect the non-combatants. Hold formation under arrows. Wait for the charge until it can be decisive. And above all, survive the first shock. After Dorylaeum, the Seljuk strategy changed. Kilij Arslan avoided another major pitched battle. Instead, the Turks turned Anatolia itself into a weapon. They withdrew, burned or stripped supplies, and left the Crusaders to cross one of the hardest landscapes of the campaign. This was the next numbers battle. Not 20,000 against 50,000. But 50,000 against hunger. The march across Anatolia was brutal. Water sources were scarce. Summer heat beat down on men in armor. Horses died from thirst and exhaustion. Pack animals collapsed. When animals died, supplies had to be abandoned or carried by men already near collapse. The Crusader army that had survived Turkish arrows now began losing strength to the road itself. Chroniclers describe people dying of thirst, animals perishing in heaps, and men rushing toward water so desperately that some drank too much and died. The army moved through a landscape where every spring mattered. A single dry day could kill more effectively than a skirmish. The loss of horses was especially devastating. The Crusader tactical system depended on heavy cavalry. A knight without a horse was still a trained warrior, but he was no longer the battlefield weapon that Western warfare had built him to be. Over the campaign, the number of usable war horses fell sharply. At Antioch, some accounts suggest only about 700 mounted knights were available at one point, a shocking reduction from the several thousand who may have begun the expedition. This changed everything. The Crusaders were not simply losing men. They were losing the very weapon that allowed them to punch above their weight. Yet they kept moving. By October 1097, they reached Antioch. Antioch was the greatest obstacle before Jerusalem. It was enormous, ancient, and heavily fortified. Its walls ran for miles, climbing mountains and enclosing a city that had been one of the great centers of the eastern Mediterranean. Towers dominated the approaches. The citadel rose above everything. The Orontes River and surrounding terrain complicated the siege. Antioch was not a small fortress that could be rushed by courage. It had to be strangled. The Crusaders began the siege in October 1097. Their army may still have included tens of thousands, but many were hungry, sick, poorly mounted, or non-combatant. The defenders under Yaghi-Cihan had perhaps several thousand soldiers inside the city. On the surface, the Crusaders had the larger force. But a besieging army far from home is in danger every day. The garrison has walls. The besiegers have weather, disease, hunger, and enemy relief armies. Winter came. The siege became a war of starvation. Food prices soared. Horses died. Men ate roots, leather, and whatever could be found. Foraging parties had to travel farther and farther from camp, exposing themselves to ambush. Disease spread. Desertion increased. Some Crusaders lowered themselves from the walls or slipped away at night. Others lost hope entirely. At Antioch, numbers became misleading. An army might have 30,000 bodies, but how many could fight? How many had horses? How many had eaten? How many could stand in armor? How many would obey orders when a relief army appeared? The Crusaders survived Antioch because they adapted. They built siege positions. They fortified their camp. They controlled key gates. They relied on local Christian assistance, maritime supply when available, and aggressive raids when necessary. Bohemond, always ambitious, also looked for a way to take the city from within. That way came through betrayal. An Armenian guard commander named Firuz agreed to help Bohemond. In June 1098, with Kerbogha of Mosul approaching at the head of a huge Muslim coalition, the Crusaders scaled the walls at night and entered Antioch. The city fell in a brutal storm of violence. But victory turned instantly into disaster. The Crusaders had captured Antioch just before Kerbogha arrived. Now they were trapped inside the city they had just taken. Kerbogha's army was one of the largest forces the Crusaders faced during the entire expedition. Estimates vary dramatically. Some modern analysis suggests his coalition may have reached a peak of 60,000 to 90,000 men, though desertions and internal divisions may have reduced it to perhaps 35,000 to 45,000 by the time of battle. The Crusaders inside Antioch may have had around 20,000 to 30,000 people capable of taking the field, though many were starving, exhausted, and demoralized. Here is the heart of the numbers story. A Crusader army of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000, trapped, starving, and low on horses, faced a Muslim coalition that may have been twice its size at battle strength and perhaps 3 times its size at its peak. On paper, the Crusaders should have been finished. They had no secure supply base. They had just endured 8 months of siege. They had lost many horses. They were inside a city with limited food. The citadel still held out against them. Kerbogha's army surrounded the city from outside. It was a siege inside a siege. The Crusaders were not just outnumbered. They were trapped between 2 enemies. Kerbogha's army, however, had a hidden weakness. It was large, but not unified. His coalition included forces from Mosul, Syria, Jazeera, and other Muslim powers, each with its own leaders, interests, rivalries, and suspicions. Some emirs feared Kerbogha as much as they feared the Franks. Some did not want him to become too powerful in Syria. Some were willing to join the campaign, but not necessarily willing to die for his ambitions. This is one of the great lessons of medieval numbers. An army of 50,000 united men may be stronger than 80,000 men who do not trust each other. Kerbogha had numbers. The Crusaders had desperation. Inside Antioch, desperation turned into religious fire. A visionary named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side. Many Crusaders believed the relic was a sign that God had not abandoned them. Skeptics existed, including Bishop Adhemar, but morale shifted. Men who had been waiting to die began to think they had been chosen to win. To modern eyes, this may seem irrational. On a medieval battlefield, morale was a weapon. A starving army that believes it is doomed collapses. A starving army that believes God has promised victory can become terrifying. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch. This was one of the boldest decisions of the First Crusade. They could not wait. Hunger would kill them. Negotiation had failed. Kerbogha would not simply let them leave. So the Crusaders opened the gates and deployed for battle. Kerbogha's forces were spread around Antioch, guarding gates and controlling approaches. This mattered. A large army is not always concentrated at the decisive point. When the Crusaders emerged, only part of the Muslim coalition could immediately oppose them. The rest had to respond across terrain, distance, confusion, and command friction. The Crusaders attacked in ordered divisions. They advanced with their remaining cavalry, infantry, and banners. Priests prayed from the walls. Men who had eaten almost nothing marched as if the whole crusade depended on the next hour, because it did. Kerbogha hesitated. He may have wanted to let the Crusaders fully deploy before crushing them, or he may have struggled to coordinate his spread-out army. Either way, the moment passed. The Crusaders gained formation. The first Muslim forces gave ground. Then the deeper weakness of the coalition appeared. Contingents began to withdraw. Some Muslim allies abandoned the field. Others refused to commit fully. What had looked like a massive army began to dissolve. Kerbogha's numerical advantage collapsed because many of his numbers were politically unreliable. By the later stages of the battle, he may have had far fewer committed troops facing a Crusader army whose morale was rising with every enemy withdrawal. The Crusaders won. This victory is astonishing because it was not a simple case of 20,000 supermen defeating 50,000 in a straight fight. It was more subtle and more useful. The Crusaders defeated a larger army by forcing it to fight at the wrong moment, in the wrong structure, with unreliable allies, after a surprise sally, while their own morale surged and the enemy coalition fractured. That is how smaller armies beat larger armies. Not by ignoring numbers, by breaking what makes numbers matter. After Antioch, the crusade should have moved quickly to Jerusalem. Instead, politics slowed it. Bohemond wanted Antioch for himself. Raymond of Toulouse wanted influence and perhaps his own power base. The leaders argued. Months passed. Disease killed Bishop Adhemar, the spiritual leader who had held the expedition together. The army's unity weakened. The poor Crusaders grew furious that the princes seemed more interested in cities and titles than in Jerusalem. The numbers continued to fall. Men deserted. Some remained in Antioch. Others died of disease. Horses remained scarce. The Crusader army that finally moved south in January 1099 was not the army that had left Constantinople. It was a hard core of survivors. By the time the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in June 1099, their fighting strength may have been around 12,000 to 15,000 infantry and perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 knights. Some broader estimates speak of around 20,000 combatants, or 20,000 total fighting-capable people with additional non-combatants. The exact number is debated, but again the direction is clear. The army had shrunk dramatically. Perhaps 50,000 people had entered Asia Minor. Perhaps 20,000 fighting men remained near the end. Only a fraction of the original cavalry survived mounted. And now they stood before Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not defended by an army of 50,000. Its Fatimid garrison was likely much smaller, perhaps several thousand troops, reinforced by city walls, towers, gates, and preparation. But the Crusaders faced a different disadvantage. They were far from friendly territory, short on water, short on timber, short on time, and threatened by a Fatimid relief army gathering in Egypt. In siege warfare, walls multiply defenders. A garrison of 3,000 behind strong walls can stop 15,000 attackers if the attackers lack engines, water, and time. The Crusaders arrived on June 7, 1099. They attacked almost immediately and failed. They lacked enough ladders, towers, and heavy equipment. Jerusalem's walls were too strong to be taken by faith and swords alone. The defenders had poisoned or blocked nearby water sources. Trees had been cut down around the city. The summer heat pressed on the Crusader camp. Men searched for water in filthy pools. Some died from drinking contaminated water. Every delay helped the Fatimids. The Crusaders needed siege engines. Then Genoese ships arrived at Jaffa with craftsmen, tools, ropes, nails, and timber. This may have saved the siege. The Crusaders dismantled ships, hauled materials inland, cut timber from distant areas, and built siege towers. These machines became the answer to Jerusalem's walls. Again, the numbers story is not only men. It is machines. A siege tower can turn a wall from an impossible obstacle into a battlefield. The Crusaders built two major siege towers, one for Raymond's southern attack near Mount Zion, and another for Godfrey's northern assault. Godfrey's tower became decisive. During the night before the final attack, his men moved the tower to a weaker section of the northern wall, surprising the defenders. On July 14th, the final assault began. The first day failed to break the city. On July 15th, Godfrey's tower reached the wall. The fighting was savage. Defenders hurled stones, arrows, and fire. Crusaders pushed through smoke, missiles, and exhaustion. The tower inched forward. At the critical moment, the Crusaders lowered a bridge from the tower to the battlements. Men rushed across. Ladders followed. The northern defense cracked. Once the Crusaders gained the wall, Jerusalem began to fall. The defenders in other sectors panicked. Raymond's forces in the south renewed their pressure. Gates were opened or seized. Crusaders poured into the city. The capture of Jerusalem was followed by massacre. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were killed in large numbers. Exact casualty figures are impossible, and medieval accounts use horrifying language shaped by triumph, trauma, and religious symbolism. Modern historians debate the scale, but there is no doubt that the sack was brutal. For the Crusaders, this was the fulfillment of the vow. For the city's inhabitants, it was catastrophe. The Crusaders had taken Jerusalem, but they were not safe. The Fatimid army was coming. The Fatimids of Egypt had lost Jerusalem only shortly before the Crusaders arrived, having taken it from the Seljuks in 1098. They now sent a relief army under Al-Afdal. Medieval sources give enormous numbers for this army, sometimes wildly inflated into the hundreds of thousands. Modern estimates are far lower, but many reconstructions still place the Fatimid force at perhaps 20,000 to 50,000, with cavalry, infantry, and camp support. The Crusaders had perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 fighting men available after Jerusalem. Some estimates suggest around 20,000 at Ascalon. Though fewer may have been fully effective, they were exhausted from the siege. They had just taken the city. They were far from Europe, Their horses were still limited. They could not afford a long defensive war. So they attacked first. On August 12, 1099, the Crusaders met the Fatimid army near Ascalon. This was the final military proof of the First Crusade. The Crusaders were probably outnumbered, perhaps by 2 to 1 if the larger modern estimates for the Fatimids are accepted. But the Fatimid army had arrived expecting to relieve or recover Jerusalem, not necessarily to face an aggressive Crusader field army so soon. Its camp was large and not fully prepared for the shock that came. The Crusaders advanced at dawn. They moved in divisions, with Godfrey, Raymond, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, Tancred, and others leading contingents. The attack hit hard. The Fatimid army struggled to deploy effectively. Surprise, aggression, and Crusader morale did the work that numbers could not. The Fatimid camp collapsed. Men fled toward Ascalon. Others were cut down. The Crusaders captured animals, supplies, and treasure. The Fatimid army was broken, and Jerusalem was secured for the moment. Ascalon completes the numbers arc of the First Crusade. At Dorylaeum, a forward Crusader column survived encirclement until reinforcements arrived. At Antioch, a starving army of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 defeated a coalition that may have been 35,000 to 45,000 by battle time and much larger at its peak. At Jerusalem, a reduced army of perhaps 12,000 to 20,000 fighting men stormed a fortified city before a relief army could arrive. At Ascalon, the same exhausted Crusaders struck a Fatimid force that may have been twice their size and drove it from the field. This is why the First Crusade remains so militarily astonishing. It was not a straight march of an overwhelming army crushing weaker enemies. It was the opposite. The Crusader army became weaker as it moved east. Its enemies changed. The Seljuks used mounted archery and terrain. The garrison of Antioch used walls and time. Kerbogha used coalition numbers. Jerusalem used fortifications and water denial. The Fatimids used a relief army. Each challenge should have ended the expedition. None did. How did 20,000 Crusaders defeat armies twice their size and take Jerusalem? They did it because numbers alone do not win wars. Numbers must be fed. Numbers must be commanded. Numbers must arrive at the right place at the right time. Numbers must trust each other. Numbers must stand when the battle turns. At Dorylaeum, Turkish numbers and mobility almost destroyed Bohemond, but the Crusaders held long enough for the second column to arrive. At Antioch, Kerbogha's numbers were undermined by rivalry, desertion, poor coordination, and the surprise of the Crusader sally. At Jerusalem, the defenders had walls, but the Crusaders built machines and attacked before the Fatimid army could save the city. At Ascalon, the Fatimids had strength, but the Crusaders had initiative. The First Crusade was won by survivors who learned under pressure. They learned not to repeat the People's Crusade's mistakes. They learned to hold formation under arrows. They learned to use Byzantine aid when it served them and ignore Byzantine interests when ambition took over. They learned to turn camps into fortresses. They learned to build siege engines from whatever material could be found. They learned that enemy coalitions could be broken by speed and shock. They learned that morale could matter as much as food, and sometimes more. But the cost was enormous. If roughly 50,000 people crossed into Asia Minor with the main crusading armies, only a fraction saw Jerusalem. Many died without ever fighting a famous battle. They died of thirst in Anatolia, disease at Antioch, hunger outside walls, arrows in ambushes, and exhaustion on roads whose names never entered legend. Horses died so quickly that the cavalry arm nearly collapsed. The poor suffered most because they had the least armor, food, money, and mobility. Victory did not mean survival for most who began. The First Crusade succeeded because enough people survived long enough to reach the decisive moments. That is a brutal kind of victory. Not clean. not inevitable, not simply miraculous. It was a campaign of attrition in which the army lost thousands, adapted, hardened, shrank, and became more dangerous precisely because those who remained had endured everything. By 1099, the Crusaders who reached Jerusalem were not the same people who had left Europe. They had seen the People's Crusade destroyed. They had survived Dorylaeum. They had crossed Anatolia. They had starved at Antioch. They had watched friends desert, die, or rot in the camp. They had eaten things no army wants to remember. They had fought from outside walls, then from inside walls, then against relief armies. They had become an army of believers, veterans, opportunists, fanatics, survivors, and killers. That army did not need to be huge. It needed to be hard enough to keep moving. And it was. The First Crusade began as a flood. It ended as a blade. A smaller, sharper, exhausted force that had learned how to survive impossible odds. That is how roughly 20,000 Crusaders, after losing thousands across 3 years, could defeat armies described as twice their size, storm one of the holiest cities on earth, and create a new Latin kingdom in the east. The road to Jerusalem was not won by numbers alone. It was won by the men who remained after the numbers had been burned away.